Hey, welcome back, part two. So, our next part of the class, I'm going to go into more basically what the Constitution says. Is there a right to peaceful protest? And there is. But I'm going to go into kind of what the ins and outs of it are and how it's kind of come to be. So, and this is good for us to know for again, this is why this is a U.S. Constitution class or a U.S. government class that we're going to do today. But really focusing more on peaceful protesting and the First Amendment and going over kind of what your First Amendment rights are, which is it's usually number one. It's the most important. It is the First Amendment. It's the first thing that when the founding fathers, when everything came from Britain and we're like, well, we're going to start our own country doing our own things. What were the problems that we saw with being under the rule of Britain? And the first thing they came up with was the First Amendment. What was the main thing? The first thing that came to mind was we want freedom of speech. We want to be able to speak our minds, and we want to be able to do it because in England, at first when we were under kind of English rule, British people did not want you to speak out. They wouldn't let people protest. And in fact, they would punish people quite harshly if they did speak out and protest. So what they did was instead is they came up with the First Amendment. So our country would be much different than British rule. So let's get started. So is there a right to peaceful protest? A person's right to air grievances or things that you have problems with without fear or retribution of censorship is a fundamental to democracy in the United States. So it is definitely a right. Free expression of one's beliefs and it's probably the greatest thing that happened with our country is so many countries around the world you can't actually express yourself freely. If you go against the country, they get upset. The government gets very upset. Whereas here, the government might not like exactly what everybody's protesting about, but we have that right to speak freely. So freedom of expression, one's beliefs, is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which generally protects free speech, freedom of religion, or freedom to not practice religion as well, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. Again, an assembly just means assembling together, which is what people do when they protest. And protesting, the time-honored practice of publicly speaking out against perceived injustices and urging action, is a form of assembly and thus protected by the Constitution. But while there is a right to peaceful protest in the U.S., peaceful being the operative word, there are limits to how it can be done. And again, like I said in the first part of the class, we've done this. We've gone to Sacramento and we've urged for action. And we've spoken out against injustices, saying, the government has promised so many programs and staff and individuals like raises and things like that, and it hasn't happened. It always gets put on the back burner, and so we go and we protest peacefully, and we walk the grounds. We go from the theater, and then we go to the Capitol, and then we'll stand there and we'll have speeches. But we do it, again, peacefully, as we're supposed to. So this is supposed to help us understand a little better about what the Constitution says when it comes to peaceful protest, the regulation of time, place, and manner of peaceful protests, and so-called free speech zones and more. So there's a bit to uncover with this, but I'll make sure to try to make it digestible. So the right to peaceful protest, what the Constitution actually says about peaceful protests. Just one sentence comprises the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting people the right to various forms of free expression. In addition to freedom of speech, religious expression, and the press, the amendment prohibits Congress. So it prohibits Congress, the First Amendment. So it's telling Congress, you can't do this. So saying Congress, we're prohibiting you from telling people that they don't have the right to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's what the amendment says. It tells Congress, listen, people have the right to have a redress of grievances. So grievances just being things that we have problems with and that we want to redress it. They address it, we redress it. They address it and say, this is what we're going to do. And we, as the people, because it is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, we can redress and say, we don't like this part of it. We want this change. We've seen what you've addressed, and we might have voted you into office, but there needs to be a change because this isn't working. After all, dissent in the American colonies was harshly punished by the British monarchy prior to independence, often through violent means. So again, if you did speak out against the British colonists, they were very harsh in their response to that. When we came up with our laws and our Constitution, we said, no, we're going to have it different, as I said before. But this right, as with other constitutional rights, is not absolute. Nothing is really absolute in life. So a case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1969 is Shuttlesworth versus Birmingham, Alabama. Came from the civil rights movement. Both protected the right to protest, so it's saying, yes, you can protest, and allowed certain limited restrictions. So saying, yes, you can protest, but there's certain restrictions that you have to have. So one of the court's holdings for this is that any licensing requirement for freedom of expression in publicly owned places is unconstitutional if it's not narrowly defined and objectively applied. So, basically what they said was so you can have peaceful protests. We encourage you to, but we need to know exactly what you're protesting. If you're going to come out, it can't just be about anything. I don't like my hairdresser and I have at least this many people that want to protest. It needs to be, what is it that you're going to be doing? Why is this important? Why is this a public interest? Which is good because it kind of narrows things down. But there are caveats and problems with it. So specifically, that decision overturned an ordinance in Birmingham, Alabama, prohibiting parades and assemblies, including protests, on city streets without a permit. So they started to ask for permits at this point. So saying, if you don't have a permit, then you can't protest here. You need a permit first. And so, it's like, okay, well, then we'll get a permit, and then we'll come do this. The court found that permit requests were denied specifically to suppress speech, not to control traffic, as the law was intended. So they said, well, you need a permit because what you're going to do, if you have this protest, is you're going to back up the streets and, people aren't going to be able to get to their houses, things like that. And so that's why we really want you to have a permit. But it was to suppress speech. It wasn't, because they could arbitrarily give out permits to some people and then say, no, you're going to cause traffic, so you can't protest this. Even if it's something that's really important to protest, they would say, no, sorry, you're going to back up traffic. You need a permit, and we're not going to give you a permit, so you may as well just go home. And so that was the problem with that one. But this decision also had the effect of cities and other jurisdictions to deny permits as long as they have a compelling objective reason to do so. Like I said. So it became more of a suppression of speech. So you couldn't actually speak out against your grievances because the government would say, well, we're not going to give you a permit. So what they did was, and they had people protest of a regulation of time, place, and manner of which you're going to peacefully protest. So while governments may not deny a person's constitutional right to peacefully protest, they may regulate the time, place, and manner in which the protest is conducted. The standard was further established by a 1989 Supreme Court decision. So when it comes down from the Supreme Court and it's been decided on, that's pretty much it is. And it's Ward versus Rock against racism. a case challenging the constitutionality of New York City's noise ordinance as applies to Rock Against Racism concerts in Central Park. So there was a Rock Against Racism in Central Park, and so the problem they had is time, place, and manner. So the time they had, the place they had, the manner is, I think, what they, it's like, okay, well, it's going to be loud, and not everybody, this is a noise ordinance. Not everybody's going to want this. It's going to keep people up. It's disturbing other people. So in the Ward decision, the court held that the noise-related restrictions are constitutional as long as any restriction of time, place, and or manner. So number one is the content neutral, meaning the content of the speech or expression may not factor into the permitting decision. Let's see. So the content of the speech or expression may not factor into the permitting decision. So as long as it's not going to be overly offensive, I guess is what they're saying. As long as it's neutral, saying everyone wants equality, we're against racism, that's fine. Then that won't factor into the permitting decision. Now, if it's going to be hate speech, that's going to be something that they might deny the permit for. Number two is narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest, such as public safety and order. And number three, leaves open ample alternative channels for communication. Expressive activity may still be conducted even if its time, place, and or manner is legally restricted in some way. So the court also has held that requiring a permit for a peaceful protest in advance is constitutional, as are additional requirements for assemblies conducted near major public events. So, for instance, a city may require protest organizers to provide details about how the protest will be conducted. So, basically, they're trying to narrow it down and say, so what exactly is it that you're protesting? What are you doing so that we can give you this permit? So we know exactly what's going to happen. So it affects, so the people that don't need to be affected by it won't be as affected by it. And time, place, and manner is actually important. But at the same time, it does kind of restrict, like, how do you know what's going to happen on any given day to where you're like, well, I need a permit for this now. Like time, place, and manner. Like, I can tell you the time that we're going to have it. I'm going to tell you the place we're going to have it. I'm going to tell you what the content is of what we're going to be protesting. And that's fair. Like, if you have something that you're like, this is something that I think we need to get out, and we want to talk about like we've done at the Capitol, that's time, place, and manner. That's we always do those three things. We let them know. We get a permit and say, this is what we're going to do. This is where we're going to march from. We're going to march to the Capitol, and this is what our manner is going to be. And we're going to be peacefully protesting. So we do this, the time, place, and manner. So, and so in advance, this is constitutional. So what we do when we go to the Capitol is constitutional, because we make sure that we're following the rules, that we're getting everything done, and we're doing it in the most streamlined fashion that you can when it comes to peaceful protests. To make sure that no one's hurt, to make sure that everyone in our groups are safe, to make sure that the public is safe. And we do it very well. And so it's very impressive that we're actually a part of it. Now, one important exception to permitting, however, is when protesters gather in response to breaking news. For example, protests immediately following, say, the 2014 police shooting of an unarmed black teenager in Ferguson did not require a permit. So that is an exception. So the things that are going on right now in terms of protest, so you can say, well, how did, nobody had a permit. People just said, we're done. There's too much going on. We're going to go protest. And it's breaking news. We've seen it on the news. We've had enough, and we're going to go do something about it. Now, you can't get a permit for that. You can't be like, well, I knew that was going to happen, so, I already made a permit for this time and place and manner. You can't do that. So what you do is, that's when this happens, but you peacefully protest. You go out and you self-govern. As we said before, you self-govern, and you make sure that you're actually taking care of yourself and doing things in a peaceful way, but getting your voice heard, especially when it comes to something that you weren't ready for. but you feel deeply about and you need to go out and protest. And, people are going out with COVID-19 and everything going on. I mean, there are issues out there that people are very, very passionate about. So that is an exception to the permitting requirement. Is if something happens on the news, you can't help it, and people are going to protest, as long as they do it peacefully, they can do that. But normally when there's something that you want to do, you do go in and you get a permit for it. And so the last part of this is wartime policies, which is free speech zones and other restrictions. So there have been crackdowns on certain protests because of wartime policies. So some of the crackdowns on peaceful protests and other forms of dissent, which means you just disagree, have shown up all throughout U.S. history, shaping laws and testing the limits of the Constitution. So, we'll get into that. Like, why would we want to suppress freedom of speech? And so they did have wartime policies, which I'll get into in just a little bit. So there was the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, for example, were passed in preparation for war with France in order to silence dissent. The series of legislation restricted speech critical of the government, among other provisions. Same as the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 followed similarly restricting speech critical of the government or war. So that's a wartime policy. And so what they say is you can't protest against the government during wartime. So they'll keep you silent because basically they're saying don't say anything critical of the government during wartime. Don't say anything critical of the government during times where it seems like we need to be only patriotic and just follow. Obviously, a lot of this got broken, especially during the Vietnam War. People spoke out against that war constantly. But it is a policy that, during wartime, that you don't speak out against your government about their practices. But people are going to do it because people still have the right to freedom of speech. But that is something that was put into the Constitution as a wartime policy, is to suppress any criticism of the government when it comes to war. And then for free speech zones, following the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001, the U.S. Secret Service expanded the use of free speech zones during the president's appearances. So a free speech zone is basically, let me read this next part and then I'll go over it. These zones, at least 500 feet from the president, are often enclosed behind fences and cordoned off to such a degree that they substantially limit the protesters' ability to express their free speech. Violations of actually kind of getting into that barrier. So basically what they're saying is the president's going to come out and speak about 9/11. And people have the right to hear, but they're going to say, but within 500 feet of the president, nobody can be in that zone. Outside of there, that is your free speech zone. Outside of that cordoned off area of at least 500 feet from the president. Everything else is free game for you to protest, but within that you can't. And if you do try to violate that and get within 500 feet of the president, you will be met with charges such as trespassing, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, or similar charges. So a free speech zone is basically, it can be expanded on where they say, yes, you can definitely have protest, but you can't protest this close to anything. You have to be outside this. It's almost like a restraining order. Like, you have to be within 500 feet of the president at all times for this. And you have to be behind these gates and everything. And if you try to climb those gates, there's a good chance that, you could be arrested. Free speech zones have also been used at the national convention of both the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as on college campuses in the 1960s and 70s, and continue to be enforced on some campuses today. So free speech zones and other suspensions of protest rights after extraordinary events have survived constitutional challenges. So basically it says, So you have the Republican National Committee, or the RNC, or the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and when they have their debates and things like that, you have to be within a certain, you have to be within a certain distance of any of the politicians that are going to be saying what they're saying. And I think it's for the safety of the politicians, things like that. But a lot of times it does kind of suppress your speech, because they're not going to hear what you have to say. You're a good 500 feet away. They have loudspeakers that are up, and they're going to be blasting their words, and they have ultimate control, within that 500 feet. And they can listen to what they want to listen to, and they can ignore what they want to ignore. But the point is still that, that's why freedom of speech is important, because you have freedom of the press, and the press is going to cover both sides. They're going to cover the side of people outside in the free speech zone, saying this is what we're fighting for, and this is what we want to see changed. But then they're also going to be covering the side of the politicians, saying, well, this is what I'm going to do about it, or this is my policy on this. And so it's important to recognize these differences. So, and if you ever have been in a peaceful protest and you feel like it's been violated, you can always contact an attorney. There's civil rights attorneys and the National Lawyer Guide for pro bono assistance. Pro bono means basically the lawyers do it for free, but you do have to have a pretty good case. But I mean, again, that's the difference between rioting and what the Constitution says is peaceful protest. So again, time, place, and manner. If you have something that you want to riot against, you have a place, you have a time, you get your permit, you say this is how we're going to do it, you can, and get a good gathering of people, you can have a protest and get that put together. And then again, if something happens that you see on the news, something that's so egregious that you feel like, I need to be a part of this, I need to protest, you don't need to get one of those permits. You can go out, but peacefully assemble. Again, when it comes down to starting to riot and break things and hurt people and hurt our country in a way, then it's going to be met with that's rioting, that's lawlessness, and then the law will be followed up on. So, but go out and peacefully protest. That is your right. Your right to stand there and say, this is what we want. This is what we need. And be part of a community. And be part of a very peaceful part of the community. And make a difference. It's a very important and different set of standards that the U.S. has that so many other countries don't. A lot of countries, it's dictatorships. They'll say, nope, you can't do that. Nope, we don't want to hear what you have to say. We're in charge. See, the thing is that in our country, the people are the ones that are actually in charge. We're the ones that will make the difference. And we have the right to. So, again, this has been a U.S. government class. We've gone over the difference between rioting and peaceful protest. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. This is good for us all to know, our history, our government as it is, and what our future might look like. So, anyway, peace to everyone, and I hope to talk to you soon, and I hope to really see you all soon. I miss your faces. Okay, bye.